In the summer of 1978, Kingsfield, Oregon, was a picture of rural calm. The town, with its red brick library, modest shops, and surrounding pine-covered hills, had a population just under 6,000. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. The most pressing issues were high school football scores and weekend farmers markets. Then, on July 18th, everything changed. 17-year-old Linda Warren disappeared on her way home from a friend's house. Her blue Volkswagen Beetle was found the next morning parked along Mill Creek Road, a narrow stretch of asphalt that curved through the forest. The engine was off, the doors were locked, and her purse sat untouched on the passenger seat. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, and no witnesses. It was as if Linda had simply vanished into thin air. At first, the town thought it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she'd show up after a few days. But days turned into weeks, and no one heard from her. Flyers were stapled to telephone poles. Search parties combed the nearby woods. Police dragged the creek. Nothing. She had disappeared completely. Just as the shock was beginning to settle, another girl went missing. 19-year-old Maria Torres disappeared on her way to the community college campus just 2 months later. Her car was found at the edge of the parking lot, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Again, no signs of struggle. No evidence. Her family insisted she wasn't the kind of girl to just leave. Investigators were baffled. There was no connection between Linda and Maria. They didn't know each other. They lived in different parts of town. But the circumstances were too similar to ignore. By early 1980, 3 more girls were gone. 21-year-old Sharon Black, 16-year-old Emily Tate, and 18-year-old Natalie Wu. Each case followed a chillingly familiar pattern. The girls vanished while alone, their vehicles or belongings left behind without signs of violence or escape. The disappearances sparked fear, then panic. Local newspapers called it a wave of vanishing daughters. Parents stopped letting their kids walk home alone. Gun sales went up. Women began carrying pepper spray and traveling in groups. For a town that had always felt safe, the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. The police struggled. They interviewed over 100 people. They set up roadblocks, questioned known offenders, even called in help from the state police. But there were no leads. No fingerprints. No forensic evidence. The investigation hit dead end after dead end. Rumors spread quickly, about a cult, about someone from out of town, even about a state park ranger who eventually left his job under suspicion, though nothing was ever proven. Then, without warning, the disappearances stopped. After Natalie Wu's case in late 1980, there were no more reports. No new victims. No further clues. The panic subsided, slowly, painfully. People began returning to normal routines, but the town had changed. Something had been broken. 5 girls had vanished, and not a single one had ever been found. Over time, the case grew cold, buried under years of silence and forgetting. But in some corners of Kingsfield, the name still lingered, the Kingsfield Phantom. A name whispered with fear, and a story no one ever truly believed was finished. In 2023, Kingsfield was no longer the sleepy town it had once been. Suburbs had stretched into the woods, coffee shops lined the once empty streets, and most of the people who remembered the string of disappearances in the late 70s had either moved away or passed on. But buried deep in the town's police archives, boxes of old evidence still sat collecting dust, remnants of crimes that were never solved and stories that had gone quiet over the decades. Alice Monroe had been a detective with the Kingsfield Police Department for over 20 years. Now retired, she worked part-time for the department as an archivist, helping digitize cold case files. She didn't expect much from the work, mostly scanning papers and labeling evidence bags from old burglaries or minor incidents. But one rainy afternoon, as she pushed a squeaky cart down the back hallway of the evidence room, she noticed a worn box shoved behind a rusted filing cabinet. Faded markers scrawled across the cardboard read, K78. Curious, she pulled it down and pried it open. Inside, she found dozens of black and white photographs, brittle notepads filled with handwritten interview notes, and several plastic bags containing items recovered from the scenes of the disappearances. One item stood out, a cracked, weathered leather strap inside an unsealed evidence pouch. A yellowing label identified it as having been found near the scene of Linda Warren's disappearance. The original officers had believed it was trash, probably a broken purse handle, and never sent it for analysis. Alice paused. Times had changed. Modern forensics could uncover details that the original investigators could only dream of. On a hunch, she submitted the strap for DNA testing using a private lab partnered with a national cold case initiative. She didn't expect much. After all, the item was over 4 decades old, handled multiple times, and likely degraded. But 2 months later, she received a call. The test had pulled a partial male DNA profile from the leather strap, enough for a match through a genealogical database. The profile didn't point directly to a suspect, but it did connect to a distant relative. After weeks of research, triangulation, and family tree analysis, the lab narrowed the DNA down to one living individual, Howard Clemens. He was 83 years old, retired, and living in Mesa, Arizona. His name had never appeared in any serious part of the original investigation. No criminal record. No known violent history. Nothing to raise suspicion. But when Alice dug deeper, she found a curious coincidence. Clemens had worked as a janitor in the Kingsfield School District from 1974 to 1981. Quiet, unremarkable jobs. Yet every single girl who had disappeared had attended one of the schools where he worked. The overlap was impossible to ignore. Even more unsettling, Clemens had left Oregon in 1981, right after the final disappearance. He had never returned. While others had forgotten the name Kingsfield Phantom, he had quietly built a new life thousands of miles away. Alice contacted the FBI. A decision was made to investigate further, but quietly. After 45 years of silence, the ghosts of Kingsfield had stirred again. And one of them now had a name. Howard Clemens lived in a modest one-story home in a quiet retirement community just outside Mesa, Arizona. His yard was neatly trimmed, his mailbox always emptied, and his porch light turned on every night. He spent his mornings feeding stray cats that wandered into his yard and his afternoons walking slowly around the block with a cane. Neighbors described him as kind, soft-spoken, and polite. To the people around him, he was just another aging man enjoying the slow rhythm of his final years. But behind that calm exterior was a life that had escaped scrutiny for decades. When federal agents began discreetly watching Clemens, nothing about his daily behavior raised alarms. He never left town. He didn't own a computer. He had a quiet, predictable routine. There were no known weapons in the house, no history of mental illness, and no contact with law enforcement in more than 40 years. If you looked at him on paper, he was clean. But DNA doesn't lie, and investigators were now sure they had found the man behind the unsolved disappearances in Kingsfield. Digging into his employment records, they discovered that Clemens had worked at 4 different schools between 1974 and 1981. These included Kingsfield High School and 2 local middle schools. The timeline aligned perfectly with the years the girls went missing. All 5 victims had either attended one of those schools or had siblings who did. In the original investigation, no one had connected the dots, likely because Clemens had stayed in the background. He wasn't a teacher or a coach. He wasn't someone students would have thought about twice. He emptied trash bins and mopped floors. He blended in. Old interview logs from 1979 revealed that police had spoken briefly with Clemens after Sharon Black's disappearance. At the time, he had no criminal record, no known connection to the victim, and was cooperative during the interview. He told investigators he didn't remember her. He was calm and respectful, gave short, polite answers, and didn't say anything unusual. Because of that, he was dismissed early in the process. Dozens of others were considered more likely suspects. It was a crucial mistake. When the FBI obtained a warrant to search his home, they weren't expecting much. The crimes had occurred 45 years ago. Any physical evidence could have been long gone. But they noticed a large metal shed on the far corner of his property, separate from the house and locked with a thick, rusted padlock. Inside, they found something far more disturbing than they anticipated. The shed was clean, organized, and cool, despite the Arizona heat. Along the walls were plastic storage bins, each labeled by year. Some held personal belongings, bracelets, hair ties, vintage purses. Others contained old newspaper clippings, neatly folded and stacked. In one bin, they found dozens of faded Polaroids, each showing a young woman, alone, captured candidly and without consent. Among the faces were the 5 girls who had vanished from Kingsfield. There was no mistaking them. Whatever quiet life Howard Clemens had built for himself, it was no longer quiet. The evidence had spoken louder than any words ever could. Inside the metal shed, investigators worked carefully and quietly, cataloging each item with gloved hands and hushed voices. It was clear that everything had been preserved with care. The air smelled faintly of old plastic and dust, yet everything inside the bins had been shielded from the elements. Each object told a story, one that had been hidden for decades. In one of the bins, they found a small jewelry box, its velvet worn but still intact. Inside were rings, earrings, and necklaces, none expensive, but all personal. Several matched descriptions given by the families of the missing girls from Kingsfield. One bracelet was engraved with the initials L.W., a gift Linda Warren had received for her 17th birthday, according to her mother's original statement in 1978. Another bin contained what appeared to be school notebooks, textbooks, and handwritten notes. Some were signed. All belonged to the victims. What shocked investigators most, however, was a thick spiral-bound notebook wrapped in a plastic bag at the bottom of a bin labeled K-Case. When they opened it, they found a list. Each page included a name, a date, a location, and a brief note. The first 5 entries matched the 5 known victims from Kingsfield. The notes were chilling in their simplicity. One said, "Waited until dark. No sound. Quick." Another read, "Wasn't supposed to be her. Still worked." But there were more than 5 names. There were 9. For names didn't appear in any Kingsfield police reports, and none were linked to missing persons cases in Oregon. A separate task force began investigating the new entries. If confirmed, they would point to victims who had never even been reported, or cases that had never been connected to Clemens. The possibility that the Kingsfield Phantom's reach extended beyond the town's borders was no longer just speculation, it was becoming fact. Tucked into the back pocket of the notebook was a single Polaroid, face down. On the reverse, written in shaky red ink, were the words, "They forgot. I didn't." When they flipped it over, they saw a photo of a young girl, standing at a bus stop, her eyes wide and unaware. Investigators couldn't identify her. She wasn't one of the original 5, and her name wasn't listed in the notebook. The discoveries in the shed sealed the case. The DNA evidence had drawn a line to Clemens, but the shed revealed the full extent of his actions. It wasn't just a case of a man hiding in plain sight. It was a man who had meticulously recorded and preserved his crimes as if he expected someone, someday, to find them. When authorities knocked on Clemens's door, he didn't seem surprised. He opened it slowly, sat down calmly, and allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. He asked no questions. He made no statements. But as he was led to the car, one of the officers noticed him glance toward the shed, just for a second, almost like a farewell. The evidence was overwhelming. The ghosts of Kingsfield had been buried, but never forgotten, not by the town, and certainly not by the man who created them. Howard Clemens's trial began in early 2024, held in a courthouse 2 states away from where his crimes had taken place. He had been extradited from Arizona to Oregon, where the original cases had originated, and where the community still bore the scars of his actions. The trial was swift by criminal court standards. There was no need for long deliberations or complex arguments. The DNA evidence, combined with the photographs, the personal belongings, and the notebook recovered from his shed, left little room for doubt. Throughout the proceedings, Clemens sat still. His face was blank, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He looked fragile, his white hair thin and combed back, his posture slouched, and his eyes dull with age. But his silence was unnerving. He never looked toward the families of the victims. He didn't flinch when the prosecution showed images of the recovered items or read from his handwritten journal. He remained detached, as though he were watching someone else's life unravel. Medical experts testified that Clemens was in the early stages of cognitive decline. He had been diagnosed with mild dementia, but he was still mentally competent. He understood where he was and why. He understood what he had done. He simply didn't care to explain any of it. Family members of the victims gave statements. Some cried. Some could barely speak. Others had waited over 4 decades for this moment and delivered their words with steady anger. They described lives shattered, futures stolen, and the long, heavy silence of unanswered questions. They spoke of birthdays missed, weddings never celebrated, and the pain of never knowing what had happened to their daughters, sisters, or friends. And now, finally, they had answers, awful ones, but answers nonetheless. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict, guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Additional charges were pending as investigations into the unknown victims listed in the notebook continued. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Given his age and health, it was effectively a death sentence. Clemens showed no reaction. Not a blink. Not a twitch. Just the same distant stare he had worn since the moment of his arrest. But then, something changed. As the courtroom emptied and guards prepared to escort him away, Clemens turned to a nearby officer and leaned in slightly. He spoke only once, in a low voice, almost conversational in tone. "So they finally remembered me," he said. The words sent a chill through the room. It was the only thing he had said since the day he was taken into custody. In that single sentence, something became terrifyingly clear. Clemens had never forgotten what he did. He hadn't repressed the memories or buried the past. He had kept trophies, written names, and preserved reminders. He had waited, not in fear of being caught, but in silence, almost as if daring time to catch up to him. Now, after 45 years, it finally had. Justice had taken its time, but it arrived all the same. The Kingsfield Phantom was no longer a mystery or a rumor. He had a name, a face, and a sentence that would follow him until the very end.